Hello everybody, long time no see. Let me make a little summary of everything that we talked about. I told you guys that figure base was an alternate notation system for harmony. The notation system that we've been using in class so far, that which tells us what the chord is and what is its inversion, is lead sheet symbols, right? Letter and quality. But that is not the one that we're going to be talking about in this video. Instead of the letter and quality, figure base uses the baseline plus some markings or some figures that tells us the intervals that are being sounded on top of that baseline. The cool thing is that just by knowing that, we can tell which chord is above that bass note, and it tells us what position the chord is in. So basically, which chord member it's on the bass. Okay, so I told you that all we need for this figure based notation is the baseline plus the figures, and the figures is nothing but the numbers, the quantity of the intervals on top of the bass. We're using the key signature of D major, so let's start with the D major chord. If we have this sonority using our lead sheet notation system, we would call it a D major in root position. We can see that the distance or the interval between the root and the third is a third, and between the root and the fifth is a fifth. So if we want to translate this into figure-based notation, we would just write the bass note, a D, and then we would just write the intervals of the notes that we want on top of that, a fifth and a third. So this would be the figure-based notation translation of that. Like I mentioned in class, remember that there is no need to indicate that the F is sharp. That is already being told to us by the key signature. Figure-based notation refers to diatonic intervals, the intervals that occur naturally within a key signature. Let's keep going. If I want this sonority, a D major on first inversion, so it has F sharp, the third, on the bass. There is still a third between the bass note and the next chord member, between the third and the fifth of this chord. And there is a sixth between the bass note and the remainder chord member, between the third and the root of this chord. So how would we write this in figure-based notation? Easy. I know that the bass note is an F sharp, and I will just write the intervals on top of that, a sixth and a third. So this is how you would notate that chord using figure-based notation. Like I mentioned in class, check out that this first time, this third is a major third between the root and the third, and this third is a minor third now. But since in figure base we only write the quantity of the intervals, that gets notated just the same as a third. No need to add anything else. If we wanted this position, a D major on second inversion, which means that it has the fifth on the bass, now we see that between the fifth and the root there is a fourth, and between the fifth and the third there is a sixth. Those are the intervals. That is the recipe that we need to follow in order to build this chord in the key signature of D major. So how would we write this in figure based? Same thing. I just write the bass note, an A, and then I just write that recipe for the intervals that I need to put on top to get that sonority. A 6 and a 4. This is all we need in order to construct those chords. And that is exactly why in figure-based notation, just by knowing the bass note and the intervals above, we can tell which chord it is and which inversion or which position it is on. And by knowing that, we can know which chord member is on the bass. In root position, the root is going to be the one on the bass. In first inversion, the third is going to be the lowest sounding note. And on second inversion, the fifth is the chord member that is going to be on the bass. And then I told you that this just seems like a lot of work. Musicians didn't like to write all those numbers all the time, so they started using abbreviations. So with the first one, with root position chords, they were like, no, there's too many root position chords and I don't want to write all those numbers all the time. Now let's just get rid of that. And every time we see a bass line with nothing below, we know that it's going to be a 5-3. It's going to be a root position chord. For the second inversion, they were like, You know what? So many chords have a third on top of the bass. Let's just assume that there is a third there. Let's erase that 3. I won't have to write it. Every time that I see a figure bass notation with just a 6, what it means is that there's a 6 and a third above the bass. And the second inversion, the 6/4 chord, I'm sure they also wanted to get rid of that one, but there was no way to abbreviate it. So they decided to just leave it like that. If you take a look at the PDF attached to your assignment this week, you're going to find this chart. And it says exactly what I just talked about. It has the complete figure bass symbols. It has the symbol most often used, so the abbreviations. So see, there's nothing for a 5/3. There's only a 6 for 6/3, and the 6/4 is kept the same. And it also shows you how to find the root of the chord. Okay, so what happens if I am in D major, but I want to have this chord? Using our lead sheet notation, we would call this an E major chord. And second inversion, it has the 5th on the bass, that B. In order to get this sonority as part of D major, we would need to use an accidental, right? Because this G sharp is not part of the key signature. So how can we notate that in figure bass? We would still write the bass note, and we would still write the intervals above it. In this case, a 6, and between the bass note and the root of this chord, we would have a 4th. And then to indicate that this chord is not just merely following the key signature, but that it has an accidental on that interval that is a 6th above the bass, we would just notate that accidental on the side of the number that is representing that interval on the figure-based markings. What if we wanted to have this sonority? This is a C major chord with E on the bass, a C major chord in first inversion. Since C natural is not part of the key signature of D major, I have to use an accidental in order to get this sonority. How would I notate that accidental using figured bass? Well, same thing. First, let's just write the intervals. Between the third and the root of this chord, there is a 6th. And then, from the bass to the 5th of this chord, there is a 3rd. And since I know that that 6 has an accidental, I would just have to notate that accidental on the side of the number of the figure bass notation. And now for the final act of this show, how do we combine the abbreviations with the accidentals? Here it is. Let's say that I wanted to write this sonority. Normally, we would just write this. We would add a sharp, showing that the third of this chord has an accidental and is raised a half step from the note that you would expect to find in D major. But remember that the musicians using these notations were feeling a little lazy and didn't want to use all these numbers when it was just a root position chord. So this was their solution. Let's keep the abbreviation, so we're not going to use any of these numbers for a root position triad. And let's just agree that every time that we find an accidental next to no number, it's going to be referring to the third above the bass. So when we find a symbol like this one, what it means is that this is a sonority that has a C sharp on the bass. Why sharp? Because it's part of the key signature. And above this bass note, it would have a 6th, in this case an A, and a 3rd. Remember that when there's nothing, we assume that there is a 3rd. That is the abbreviation that we're using. But also that that 3rd is raised a half step by using a sharp. If I was trying to find the lead sheet symbol for this sonority, I would write all 3 pitches and then find a way to organize them into thirds, to stack them into thirds, which would be exactly this. And then I would ask myself, what are the intervals between these pitches, between these notes? Between the root and the third, there is a major third. And between the third and the 5th, there is another major third. And just to double check the extra condition, I would see that between the 5th and the root, it has an augmented 5th. E sharp is not part of the key signature of A major. E is, and by adding that sharp to the E, I am expanding this interval. So I'm turning it from a perfect fifth to an augmented fifth. What can we infer from all of this? That the way to notate this sonority using lead sheet symbols would be to call it an A augmented with C sharp on the bass. So good, we're almost there, almost reaching the end of this video. This is where we left things in class. So let's continue. Let's figure out what the next chord is. I know that when I find a 6 as the figure of this figure bass, it really means that it is the abbreviation of a sonority that has a 6 and a third above the bass. I know that this bass is a B flat, so I know that a third is a D and a 6 on top of that is a G. This is a G minor chord with B flat on the bass, a G minor chord on its first inversion. Next one, I see nothing below it. I know that when there is nothing below the bass, what it really means is that there is a fifth and a third above that bass note. So let's do it. Here's a C, here is a third above that C, it's an E flat, and here is a fifth above that bass, a G, which would make this a C minor chord in root position. Why minor? Because I see that it has a minor third between the root and the third, a major third between the third and the fifth, and a perfect fifth between C and G, between the root and the fifth. Let's keep going because this is getting interesting. The next sonority has a D on the bass, a fourth above it, which is a G, and then a sixth above it, that is a B flat. Why B flat? Because it is on the key signature. If I want to know the lead sheet symbol for this sonority, I would just take all the pitches that I see and try to stack them in thirds. The way to do so is by taking the D and putting it up there. So this is a G minor triad. On its second inversion, it has D, which is the fifth on the bass. The next one is an example of what we were just talking about. It has no numbers, so I know that no numbers is an abbreviation for a 5-3, and it has a sharp. And what did I say about when we have an accidental next to nothing? That it always refers to the note that is a third above the bass. So really the complete figure bass symbol for this would really be a figure that tells us that there is going to be a fifth and a third above the bass, and that third is going to be raised by a half step with a sharp. So what is it? I just take the D on the bass, I find a third above it and add a sharp, because that is what these are telling me to do, and then I write a fifth above that bass. This is a D major chord on root position. And for the last one, which I just changed because it makes more sense, I know that this figure bass symbol is really talking about a sonority that has a fifth and a third above the bass. Why do I know that? Because it has no numbers, and I know that when it has no numbers, it means 5 and 3. But I also have an accidental, I have a natural, and since it is next to nothing, I know that it is referring to the note that happens to be a third above the bass. So easy, let's do it. This is my bass note. I'm gonna have a third above it, but that third is gonna have a natural. And then I'm gonna have a fifth, that D. What is that chord? It's a G major chord on root position. You wanna hear how this progression would sound? This is it for this one. Good luck on that assignment and have a good weekend. Bye bye, guys.